Hello and welcome back to my stream. Today I'm going to be reading from the Charwoman Shadow, starting at chapter 7. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Chapter 7. Ramon Alonzo Follows the Art. So fast the magician came striding back to his room with the letter he had from Peter, that Ramon Alonzo's eye had scarce time to rove, and had not found the long, thin box for which it began to seek. One thought alone, to rescue the Charwoman's shadow, was filling his generous young mind. When the magician gave him the letter that came from his father. The letter he read alone, though the magician proffered his aid. But Ramon Alonzo was eager to use his new learning. The magician therefore watched his face as he read, and learned thereby as much of the letter as Father Joseph had guessed of its purpose. For the thoughts of men were much the concern of them both. When Ramon Alonzo had read the letter, he sighed. Farewell, he thought, to his shadow. He began to think of it as he had never thought before. A mood came on him such as comes on us sometimes at sunset, when shadows are many and long. Yet we never think of shadows as he then thought of his. Wistful pictures of the slender, intangible thing were brooding in his mind. He, too, was learning how one may love one's shadow. Such fancies as we may sometimes have for swallows, when we see them gathering to leave us, such feelings as men may have of far-off cliffs of a native land they are losing. Such longing as schoolboys have for home on the last day of holidays. All these Ramon Alonzo felt, for the first time, for his shadow. And then he thought of his sword, and reflected that it could not be for him as it was for that poor old woman. Men had not the need, as a woman had, of the protection of common things that the vulgar set store by. If any would not speak with him because he had lost his shadow, the matter could be argued courteously with the sword. And as for stones, he esteemed that none would dare to throw them, nor he care if they threw. So he looked up at the magician and, with some echo of sorrow touching his tones, said, Master, I fain would learn the making of gold. The master glanced at a magic book, for a moment refreshing his memory. The fee is your shadow, he said. And once more Ramon Alonzo thought of the grace of his shadow, and the years they'd been together. He remembered its lightness, its pranks, its patient followings. He thought of long journeys together, returning at close of day. He growing wearier at every step, and the shadows stronger and stronger. He hesitated, and the magician saw him. Then to close his finger and thumb upon that young shadow, and add it to the band of which he was master. The master of the art made a sudden concession, and so closed the bargain. Out of the gratitude I bear to your grandfather, he said, I will give you a false one, to wear at your hills in its place. One shadow were as good as another, thought Ramon Alonzo, unless it had any evil or sinister shape. Will it be even as mine? Said he. I will shape it exactly so, as artists make their pictures. It was enough. Who would not have made such a bargain? How could he have guessed the truth of that duplicate shadow? Before I receive my fee, said the magician, I will make the copy. Stand now in the light of the window, that the copy may be exact. And Ramon Alonzo stood where he was told. Then the master, with eyes intent on the young man's shadow, cut a copy from out of the gloom that hung in the air, using a blade that he held between finger and thumb, too tiny for earthly uses. While with his left hand, by tent signs and beckonings, he held Ramon Alonzo rigid, so that his shadow might make no stir. Then he cut from the gloom a shadow so like to the human one, that when he carefully laid it out on the floor side by side with the true one, none could have guessed which was which, except that the new one's hills as yet were attached to nothing mortal. A space of light, like the shape of Ramon Alonzo, hung for a while in the dark of the air from which the shadow was cut. Then the gloom fell gradually in on it. See, said the magician, pointing to the two shadows, and the young man turned his head. Certainly, no one that wished to part with his shadow could have desired a better copy. "The likeness," said Ramon Alonzo, "is admirable." Then the magician went to the young man's heels and severed his shadow with the same curious instruments with which he had cut the other out of the gloom. And holding it tight in one hand, he picked up the copy in the other, and placed it nearer, and as soon as the false shadow came nearer Ramon Alonzo's heels, it ran to them. He moved from his place, and the false shadow moved with him. There was no appreciable change, and yet he had paid his fee to the magician, and was about to receive that learning that had been the goal of so many philosophers. And now the magician, still holding the shadow tight, leaned over a crocodile, and after a moment's rummaging, picked up a long, thin box from the dark of the cobwebs. By its great length and narrowness and lightness, for the magician lifted it easily with one hand, Ramon Alonzo knew it for the shadow box. It was padlocked, but in the padlock was no keyhole. He watched the master go to his lectern and put down the book and turn over several pages of the great Cathayan book. He saw upon which page his eye rested, a page with one spell upon it in 3 black Cathayan characters. Then the master closed the book and set a spell to the padlock, but in so low a voice that Ramon Alonzo heard never a word. The padlock opened, the master raised the lid, and in went his shadow. For a moment, the young man saw in the box a mass of wriggling grayness. Then the lid shut down, and the keyless padlock snapped. Then the master took down from a shelf the philosopher's stone, an object no larger than a small bird, and of texture and color similar to what we call fire clay, but of a slightly yellower tint. Its shape resembled the shape of the lumps of pumice we use. This he took to his lectern, and put down beside the book, but before lecturing upon its use he explained to Ramon Alonzo that many had sought it, as the world knew, and many had found it, as the world knew not. With this the philosophers made gold by touching certain metals upon which he would afterwards discourse, in a certain manner, which he would later explain. And when they had done with the gold, they usually buried it in the extremes of Africa, or in a continent that there was to the south, or in other places beyond the possessions of Spain, so that the object of their experiments should not corrupt men. He then discoursed on the power of gold to corrupt the unlearned. But this Ramon Alonzo had already studied in the school of the good fathers, so he let his thoughts roam far from the gloomy house, whither his body had not gone since first he had entered it so many days ago. He thought of the village of Aragona, its flowers, its merry houses, the trees with their deep-leaved branches bending over its happy lanes, and its simple mortal people following their earthly callings, so that soon he had planned to see that world again with its sunlight, movement, and voices, of which he had only known for some days now through the black letters of books. As the magician ended his lecture on the corrupting power of gold, the young man, through force of habit, murmured Amen. The magician stepped sideways and made, swift as a parry, a sign to guard himself, that was not the sign of the cross. And then Ramon Alonzo felt again that confusion that had troubled him once when he inadvertently swore, while the Bishop of Salamanca rode near on his mule. The bishop had not hurt him, and all had been well. The brief silence was broken by the master of the art, who said, "Tomorrow I will discourse on those metals whose structure, most nearly resembling the structure of gold, are therefore most adaptable to the changes of transmutation." "Master," said Ramon Alonzo, "I pray you to give me half a holiday." "For what purpose?" asked the magician. "To see the world," said Ramon Alonzo, "as far as Aragona." "There is nothing," replied the magician, "to be learned in the world that is not taught in this house. Moreover, there is no error in this wood, but fair beyond it you shall meet much error, to the confusion of true learning." "All error that I meet beyond this wood I hope to correct by your teaching," said Ramon Alonzo. The ancient mind of the magician perpetually refreshed through the ages and stored with wisdom that few have time to acquire, perceived the ring of mere flattery in this statement, and yet he was not immune from this earthly seduction. He let Ramon Alonzo go. "Go in the morning," he said, "and be back before the sun is westering." Ramon Alonzo rejoiced, but the magician only cared that he got the young man's shadow, for his power was chiefly over shadowy things, and he lusted for shadows as others lust for the substance, having learned by ages of learning the utter vanity of substantial things. And he counted the secret of gold well yielded up in exchange for a shadow, for he knew how men set their hearts and hopes on gold, and how it failed them, and wot well that these hopes could not be built on a shadow. And Ramon Alonzo went, light of heart, to find the charwoman, to let her see how little, as he supposed, he had lost by giving away his shadow. The magician returned to his box and took all his shadows out, and enjoyed amongst them a while that absolute power that ancient monarchs had, who had no laws to control them, or hostile neighbors to fear. And while the magician was reveling in his power, in the quiet and gloom of his room, Ramon Alonzo, guided by his more human sympathies, was telling the charwoman that he had seen the shadow box, and knew where it lay in the cobwebs behind a crocodile, and hoped, somehow, to coax it open and rescue her shadow. While she sighed and shook her head, he walked often up and down before a window, so that she saw the shadow, and could see she never suspected the price he had paid for the sight he had had of the shadow box. And he, as he saw that perfect copy running so nimbly behind him, believed, with the blindness of youth, that he had paid nothing. Chapter 8. Ramon Alonzo shares the idleness of the maidens of Aragona. Next morning, Ramon Alonzo descended blithely the steps of timber and stone, and soon he was listening to the magician's lecture with his thoughts away in the village of Aragona. The magician explained that there was but one element, of which all material things were composed, but that the fragments of this element that made all matter were variously and diversely knit together. When these elemental fragments were closely associated, he explained that their bulk was heavy, and often smooth. When more loosely knit, the material they formed was lighter and of a rougher surface. To change, therefore, the mere arrangement of its fragments was to change one metal to another, at least in the estimation of the vulgar, who knew not that there was but one element, and that no true change was possible, all matter being only the varying aspects of an element eternally unchangeable. Even water was made of it, and even air. "Hence," said the master of the art, "we see the superiority of spiritual things, which are of a vast multiplicity, while matter is but one. Moreover, spirits have much control over matter, while matter has neither the will nor knowledge nor power to affect one spirit, even though it may chance upon a journey to come close to a whole world." And the magician continued his theme, so that never was the cause of the spirit so ably pleaded, nor matter more humbled, nor all its pretensions more completely exposed. But Ramon Alonzo's daydreams were in arbors of Aragona, and they did not return thence until the magician, looking out carefully at the height of the sun, said, "Now you may go down to the haunts of error until the sun is westering. And now this lesson concludes, but be sure that you have learned a great wisdom in learning the oneness of matter that is to be found in the changing of its manifestations out of its leaden form, so that that form which is held in greater esteem by the vulgar." Once he warned the young man against lateness, who then sped blithely away, passing out through the old green door through which he had come only once, and seeming to see in his shadow a sprightly merriness that was as eager as he to be out in the summer morning away from the gloom of the house. The young man and the still younger shadow went laughing and leaping together down the slope, and soon between trunks of the trees came glimpses of Aragona, a village sunning itself in the merry glint of the golden Spanish air. Blithe in that glittering air, as they came from the wood, the shadow reveled over the flowers and grass, and felt the soft touch of small leaves that it had not known before. It was in the afternoon that they came to Aragona, but a little before the hour at which the master had made the shadow. It was nearly 1 day old. Ramon Alonso turned then and looked at it carefully, to see if it had pelled in 23 hours. It was as strong a gray as ever. Untroubled then by any lingering anxiety, he strode manfully into the village, and his shadow strode beside him. He glanced at it once or twice to see that it still was there, until finally reassured, he forgot it entirely. And soon he saw a gathering of maidens who had come out to be merry together, lest there should be a hush in the little street while all the men were working in the fields. They laughed when they saw him come by the way from the wood, for so few came that way. He halted a little way from them and doffed his hat, and the blue plume floated from it large and long, and they all laughed again. "Who are you?" said one, and laughed to hear herself speak out thus to a stranger. "Don Ramon Alonso of the Tower and Rocky Forest," he answered simply. "That's over there," said one, "but you come from the wood." "I'm sitting there with a learned man," he said. "The saints defend us!" cried another. "There's no learned man in the wood." "You know the wood, señorita?" he asked. "The saints forbid," she said. "None goes to the wood. There may be aught there, but there's no learned man." And at a look of alarm that he saw on their faces, he added, "His house is beyond the wood, upon the other side." And the fear went from their faces, and they were merry again. Long after, he confessed to Father Joseph that he had made the statement that fell short of the truth, or, to be exact, went over it, and Father Joseph put the matter away with a wave of the hand and the words, "A geographical error." He had heavy work to do that day, giving absolution for traffic with the black art. And then one or two called out to him, "What do you study?" "The different branches of learning," said Ramon Alonso. And then they all cried out such questions as, "What is 3 times 27? What is 9 times 90? Can you divide 180 by 7? "That is arithmetic," answered Ramon Alonso, and they were a little awed by his learning, though they did not cease to laugh. Then he sought to make some remark that would be pleasing to them, and many a happy phrase came fast to his mind, and yet he said none of them, for there were so many maidens, and if they should all laugh together, he feared for his tender phrases, which were such as should have been said softly at evening, when all voices are low and laughter has all been hushed by the rise of a huge moon. Instead, he asked them some question as to what they did, without even wishing an answer. "We are watching for strangers," said the tallest. "Why?" he asked, for she stood there waiting for him to speak. "For our amusement," she said. There was no evading their laughter. But when they had laughed enough, they turned again to their former occupation, which had been to watch a beetle that crawled on the road, leaving tracks on the thick white dust. And they let Ramon Alonso watch it with them, for during the ordeal of laughter not one of those frivolous eyes but had been watching him shrewdly, and now he was judged, and favorably. Had they been less frivolous, even very learned, had they worn robes and wigs, had they called evidence and employed counsel, and taken days or weeks instead of moments, that judgment would not have been wiser. Bells were heard now, and then, high over them, their echoes lingering drowsily, hawks rested on the heavy summer air. Bright insects shone in it. The idleness that charmed those southern lands and blessed the golden age was theirs to toy with, and they let the young man share it. When the novelty of the beetle and his tracks was lost, they turned to other interests, and when they wearied of these, they changed again, following novelty yet. And so the afternoon wore away, and the sun went slanting over their happy idleness, when Ramon Alonso suddenly saw that it soon would be westering, and all at once remembered the warning of the magician. So he made swift farewells, meeting laughing words with words as light as them, and strode away towards the wood. A glance at his shadow seemed to show that it was not so late as he feared, and then he came into the shade of the trees. To find the house in the wood was not easy, even though he knew the way. The closer he got, the harder it seemed to become, and when he knew that he was within a few paces of it, he could see no sign of any house at all. Then he stepped round the trunk of an oak tree, and there it was. The green door opened to him, and walking into the house he soon saw the darker form of the magician standing amongst the dimness. "You are late," said the master of the art. Ramon Alonzo made courteous apologies. "Did anything happen?" asked the magician. "No," said the young man wonderingly. "It is well," said the magician. To what had the master referred? Pondered Ramon Alonzo. What should have happened? Throughout his supper he wondered. Then he drank of that magical wine which so illumined the mind in the brief while of its power, but the wine only filled him with fear of the strange new shadow. When the fear faded, as it rapidly did, he had one more matter to ponder, for he had promised that band of maidens that he would join them again in 2 days' time, for some purpose that they had named too trivial for record. He was pondering some way of asking his mystery for leave to go once more to the frivolous fields that lay beyond that wood, and looking for reasons for his request that might not appear too flippant when exposed to the scrutiny of the magical wisdom that the master of the art had gleaned from the ages. And as he pondered, night came down on the wood, and the unnatural gloom of the house grew naturally deeper. He would have found the charwoman then, to gladden her with the talk of his gay outing, and tells of the frivolous fields and news of her Aragona. But he knew not where she was. Whatever room she frequented lay beyond his explorations. Then it was bedtime for him, and soon he was asleep in his spidery room, dreaming of Aragona. And in all dreamland he saw not that band of maidens with whom he had toyed in the golden afternoon, but always only a face far fairer than theirs, which he had never seen before, and yet knew with the knowledge of dreams to be the face of the charwoman. Chapter 9. The Technique of Alchemy. In the glittering morning that came even to that wood, through layers and layers of leafiness, Ramon Alonzo arose. And first he found the charwoman, at work where she mostly worked, on that deep stained stone. "Anemone," he said, "I have been to Aragona."
"Ah, Aragona,"
she answered wistfully.
"Was it very fair?"
And he spoke of its beauty, resting amongst its lanes and arbors and the wide plains dreaming around it, lit with a myriad flowers, and its spires rising above the trees and the houses, taking the sunlight direct from the face of the sun, like planets out in ether. He spoke of the gladdening voices of its bells, like merriment amongst a band of grave old men, wandering through summer air. It was not hard to praise Aragona's beauty. And then he told her such names as he had heard of the folk that dwelt in the village, and little tales of some of the older ones that he had got from the maiden's prattle. But to all this she shook her head mournfully, and would hear more of the lanes and the arbors, so he told of these and the pomegranate groves, but even then there often came over her that mournful look again, and she drooped her head and murmured, "Changed, all changed." Only when he spoke of the hills far off, and of the tiny valley of the stream that tinkled through Aragona, did content descend on her like an old priest's blessing, given with outstretched hands on some serene evening, as she listened beside her pail overfull of a calm joy. And when he saw her face as she knelt by her work, sitting back on her heels, arms limp, hands lightly folded, listening with quiet rapture to every word that he told of the old Aragona that lived in her ancient memories, he determined that she should go to her village again, and should take a shadow to show in the face of all men. So he said, "I will get you a shadow. The master shall make you a false one." He had used confidence that the magician would do this for him as soon as he asked it, and if not, he should do it because of his grandfather, who taught him boar hunting. But she cried out, "A false shadow! That is of no avail, a mere piece of darkness. He has my own good shadow. Of what use are his strips of gloom?" And all the while his own shadow lay full on the floor beside her, as good a shadow as any man's. He smiled quietly and said nothing. Then the young man hastened away to the room that was sacred to magic, for he knew the magician awaited him. And the first thing he said when he reached it, and saw the blacker mass of the magician out-darkening the gloom of the room, was, "Master, will you make me a shadow for me to give to the charwoman?"
"What should she do with a shadow?"
he said. I know not, said Ramon Alonzo, but I would give her one.
Idleness comes of such gifts, the magician replied. She will go to the villages with it and flaunt it there amongst common mundane things. It will lead her towards all that is earthly, for what is commoner or more vain than a shadow?
The young man knew not how to answer this. I would give her a present, he said, of some such trifle.
Brooches and earthly gods are for these uses, replied the master, but the wisdom that I have drawn from so many ages is not for such as her.
I pray you give it to me, said Ramon Alonzo, for the sake of what my grandfather taught you of boar hunting.
The teaching that I had from that great philosopher, said the magician, is not to be mentioned beside the vanity of a charwoman's shadow. Yet, since you have invoked that potent honored name, I will make the shadow you seek. Bid her therefore come and stand before my door, that I may copy her shadow even as artists do.
At once Ramon Alonzo left the room that was sacred to magic, to bring the good news to the charwoman, and found her still at that stone. He will make you a shadow, he cried, a fine new shadow. But none of his eagerness found any reflection in her wan, worn face, and she only repeated with sorrowful scorn,
A piece of common darkness. I know his stripes of gloom.
Then said Ramon Alonzo, Is my shadow common darkness? Is my shadow mere gloom? And he pointed towards it lying beside her pail.
Yours? She cried. No, yours is a proper shadow, a fine lithe shadow, beautiful, glossy, and young. A good sleek shadow, a joy to the wild grasses. Aye, that is a shadow. God bless us, there are shadows still in the world.
And he laughed to hear her. Then this shadow of mine, he said gaily, is no more than what you shall have. He made it.
He made it!
She cried out, all with a sudden gasp. Yes, he laughed. He made it 2 days ago, and you've seen it many a time and never knew till I told you.
Oh, your shadow, she wailed, and I warned you. Your sweet young shadow in his detestable box. Oh, your gray slender shadow, and I warned you. Oh, why did you do it? I warned you. So proper a shadow, now it drifts about beyond the world, or wherever he sends it when he takes it out of his box, doing his heathen errands and hobnobbing with demons.
But this shadow, he said, pointing to the one that lay now at his heels, a little pale in that house, but gray enough, as he knew, in the sunlight and on the grasses. Is not this shadow slender and gray enough? You have just said so.
I did not know, she wailed. I did not know.
Is any shadow better? He asked, but she was weeping, all bent up by her pail. He waited, and still she wept. Come, he said, the master will make you a shadow. But she only shook her head and continued weeping. And when he saw that, for whatever reason, she was weeping over his shadow, and that nothing he said could solace her, he left at last with the shadow that only made her weep. As he entered the room again that was sacred to magic, he saw the magician standing all in the midst of the gloom. She will not come, said the young man, and somewhat hastily the master of the art passed from that topic.
We will then examine, he said, the differences in the kinship of various metals with gold, in order that we may choose that, with least disturbance, can be transmuted to the arrangement of the element which forms the rarer metal. And this, as all men know, is accomplished by means of the philosopher's stone, and the proper handling of which I will instruct you tomorrow, together with all spells that pertain to it, for there is a special dictology or study of spells belonging only to the use of this stone.
He then lay on his lectern, in view of Ramon Alonzo, several angular pieces of metal of different kinds, of a convenient size for handling. About these he lectured with all that volume of knowledge that, in his long time on earth, he had learned concerning the rocks that compose our planet.
The arrangement of the element, he said, is most near in lead to that which it takes in forming the structure of gold. And this arrangement, the fitting together of particle into particle, is easy to be expounded, were it not for one thing, and but for one thing, lead were transmuted to gold with facility. This one thing is color, for in the final arrangement of the particles, when all else is understood, there's a certain aspect of them which produceth color, that of all mundane things is the least to be comprehended.
Color, said Ramon Alonzo, his roving youthful fancy called back to that gloomy room by hearing the master attribute a wonder to color, with which he'd been familiar through all the years of his life.
"Aye,"
said the master.
"the outward manifestation of all material things that come to our knowledge, and yet the nature of it has baffled, and is still baffling, the studies of the most learned amongst mankind. For this reason alone, there are those that have discarded the study of matter, caring little to struggle with difficulty in so trivial a business as to seek for the meaning and use of material things. To other branches of study, whatever their difficulty, we are lured by the chance of prizes beyond estimation. These, however, concern you not, having chosen the humble study whose lore we now consider. Color then depends upon the arrangement of the element in its most subtle form. Were there only one color, we should esteem that it was the natural manner in which light affected surfaces. Yet are there four, and these must therefore depend on a variation of surface profoundly intricate. Now, it is the nature of gold that wherever and however it be cut or powdered or melted or broken, the surface presented is yellow, and the delicate arrangement of particles that in other metals presents other colors than this needs to be overcome. For without this, transmutation is not accomplished. And but for this color, the changing of lead into gold were amongst the easiest of all the traffickings men have with material things. And if the vulgar would accept as gold what is truly gold in its essence, although it be black, the business were easy enough. But it has been ascertained that in regard to this, they are stubborn."
Then, taking up a piece of iron pyrites, he explained how by mingling various metals together, the student could acquire the color of one, the hardness or softness of another, and so blend them that the weight of the whole mass should be what was desired, and it should be in all respects most suited to undergo those changes that were to be caused by the use of the philosopher's stone. The lecture that he delivered that day, with all the metals before him, upon the preparations for transmutation, has probably seldom been surpassed. For he had for the material of his discourse the wisdom of those ages that had preceded him, while a few centuries later the study of the philosopher's stone fell much into desuetude. Yet who shall estimate the relative excellence of lectures on transmutation, seeing that they have ever been given in gloom and secrecy to classes of ones and twos? And Ramon Alonzo listened docilely, not, as might have been thought, because to learn transmutation was the object of his sojourn in that dim house, but because he awaited a favorable opportunity, an amiable mood in the magician, when he might ask for leave once more to return to the fields of frivolity, and not till evening came, and the magician banished him from his sacred room, in order that, as Ramon Alonzo knew, he might play some secret game with his captive shadows, did the young man learn with shrewd intuitions of youth that he cared far more for the fee that he had in his box than for any learning he might impart as his part of the bargain. He did not look for anemone that evening, for he saw that the sight of his shadow troubled her, believing her overwrought by the loss of her own, and deciding to renew the magician's offer in a few days when she was calmer. That she should have a shadow again, he was determined, and walk without hurt or taunt in her Aragona. As he went to his room that night up the stairway of stone, with a candle all blobs of tallow and ragged wicks spluttering within a lanthorn, he had an idea for a moment on one of the steps that there was something wrong with his shadow. But he looked again, holding the lantern steadier, and the idea, or the fear, passed. Chapter 10. The Exposure of the False Shadows. The work of the morning was to learn the correct application of the smooth philosopher's stone to the surfaces of metal that had been already so blended that they approached in texture and color to the texture and color of gold, and were thus already prepared to receive the changes to be given their element by the touch of the stone. "Without this preparation," the magician warned his pupil, "the change in the element is too violent, and has in former times not merely wrecked, but entirely transmuted the houses of certain philosophers, whereby the world has lost such store of learning as may in no wise be estimated. Nor is it well to attempt the change of the element in too great a bulk at one time, as men have done when too greatly drawn by the lure of material things, seeking to change whole mountains, which far from bringing them gold, has been the cause of volcanoes.
Now, the application of the Philosopher's Stone is made in this manner. Having chosen suitable metals to avoid too enormous a change, in such bulk as will cause no calamity, pass this stone over the surface with the exact rhythm that there is in the spell you use. There are many spells as there are many metals. And he brought from a box in his two handfuls a bundle of small scrolls. Ramon Alonso had believed he was about to be shown the secret, saw then, as the magician slowly sorted the scrolls, that there was still much to be taught. He had been patient all the day before, but now the light that shone through the volume of leaves, coming down cliffs of greenness, called to his inner being with so imperious a call that it almost seemed as though Spain, and the musical summer, and the mighty sun himself, and the blue spaces of ether, all longed for Ramon Alonso to wander to Aragona to toy with the idle maidens through empty hours of merriment. And a bird called out of the wood, and Ramon Alonso felt that he must go. "Master," he said, "may I go once more to the fields of error? I have some business there not worthy of your attention, yet to myself it is pressing." The magician made a certain show of reluctance to conceal the truth that he cared for little but his fee of the young man's shadow, and meant soon to send him away, content with the vain acquirements of transmutation. For so it seemed to the magician. And then he gave him leave, but with an earnestness far more real, and a vehemence that seemed genuine. He warned his pupil again to be back before evening. And swift as dust on draughts that sometimes moaned in those chambers, and gay and light as the leaves, away went Ramon Alonso. And once more the golden morning was before him as he came down from the wood, and Aragona twinkled in the distance. And partly his heart was full of a frivolous laughter, and partly a wistful feeling all grave and strange. For the spires of Aragona moved even youth to solemnity, and none knew how this was, for the spires were bright and glad. He gave one glance at his shadow, to see that all was well with it, then strode over glittering grass with the shadow striding beside him. And so he came untired to the edge of the village, and saw there the band of maidens, where they had promised to be. Blithe on the idle air came the merriment of their welcome. And not a levity that blew their way on the azure morning, and not a vanity that reached their thoughts, going from mind to mind, but they welcomed and toyed with and acclaimed as new. So they passed the morning, and when the heat of the day began to increase, they loitered to a lane that had one long leafy roof, and there they sat in the shade, and ate fruit that they had in baskets, and listened while each in turn recounted the idlest tales. And the meed of every tale that pleased was laughter, and not a learned conceit nor studious fancy was allowed to intrude in any tale they told. After the wisdom that burdened the house in the wood, and the learning with which its very gloom was laden, its ancient store of saws and sayings and formulae, Ramon Alonso rejoiced at every quip that they uttered, and every peal of laughter that followed each quip, as the traveler over Sahara welcomes the pools and the mountains, and the bands of butterflies that gather about them. In the heavy, leafy shade, they laughed or talked continually, while all round them Spain slept through the middle hours of the day. And many a tale they told of surpassing lightness, too light to cross the ages and reach this day, even if they were worthy, but lost with all the little things that founder in the long reaches of time, to be cast on the coasts of oblivion, amongst unrecorded tunes and children's dreams, and scepters of unsuccessful emperors. And when shafts of sunlight slanted, and voices from beyond their lane showed that Spain was awaking, and the grandeur of the sun was past and he grew genial again, then they loitered out into the light, straying towards the hills, and as they wandered there, other young men joined them, leaving their work till the morrow, for morrows, they said, would be many. Young, dark-skinned men with scarlet sashes flashing around their waists. Then the party drifted asunder, as shallow streams in sunny sandy spaces, when the water takes many ways, all of them gold and light-laden. And a tall, dark maiden drifted with Ramon Alonso, and one more slender than she, and the first was named Ariona, and the second Lolune. And sometimes fair fancies came to
and sometimes fair fancies came to Ariona, by which that band of maidens was often guided, because they were strange and new. But the slender form of Lolune was driven by any fancy, in whatever mind it arose. The song would guide her, or any merriment lead her, as though she had less weight than these invisible things, as the thistledowns had less weight than the south wind. And as they drifted slowly towards the low western hills, Ramon Alonso saw that the sun was westering, and remembered the warning of the magician. "I must go," he said. "Go?" said the two maidens, as though to leave that low sunlight to go alone through the wood were some monstrous imagination. "I must return to the learned man, with whom I study beyond the wood," he said. "He desires me to go back with him this evening." "Oh," said Lolune. She was shocked to hear of such a demand. "He wishes to investigate with me one of the branches of learning." Then the two girls' laughter on the mellow air rang out against learning, and trills of it floated as far as the hills, and echoes came back to the fields, and went wandering fainter and further, and in all the ways that heard them there was no thoughts of learning. And Ramon Alonso's plans were laughed away, as in later days the Armada was broken by storm. And so he forsook his intention to return to the house in the wood. He long remembered those trills of merry laughter, for not for long was he free of care again. Driven then by those gusts of laughter, as small ships are by light breezes, he came with the girls to the hills when the sun was low, and drifting all aimless on, they went up the slope, prattling and laughing and straying, led by whatever fancy led Ariona. And her fancy was to see the willowy lands that lay beyond the hill, with their trees and the shadowed grass looking strange in the evening. At such a place and at such a time she felt whatever there was of fairy in our world would show clear hints for any girl to guess. And the further they got, the eagerer grew Lolune to find whatever it was for which Ariona was searching. And these impulses holding fair, Ramon Alonso still went on before them. And so they came to the ridge of the hill, and saw the willowy lands. The low sun glittered in their faces, no longer a flashing center of power avoided by human eyes, but a mystery, an enchantment, almost to be shared by man, and wholly shared by solitary trees and bands of shrubs, far off on the wild plain, which now drew a mystery about them, as men in the tended fields began to draw their cloaks. They gazed some while in silence at those strange lands, which none saw from any window in Aragona, seeking their mystery, which was almost clear, and was coming nearer and nearer, and finding it, but for the tiniest shrubs and shadows, amongst which it hid, though barely its secret enchantment. And as they looked at that strangeness, part spell and part blessing, descending on all those acres out of the evening, not a ripple of laughter shook the calm of their wonder. And then a cold wind blew for only a moment, rising up from its sleep in nowhere, and moving to distant cells. And they stirred as the wind went by, and their search was ended. They turned round then to look back at Aragona, with the late light in its spires, and its windows flashing, and saw men drawing toward it home from the fields. They stood there wondering to see how far they'd come, waiting in idleness for the next whim to guide them, a little band of 3, with the young man in the middle. The slope they had just climbed lay golden below them. Then Ariona screamed. Again she screamed, before Lolune had followed her the gaze of her terrified eyes. Then scream after scream went up from Lolune also. Ramon Alonso stood silent in sheer amazement between them. Then they sprang away from him, making the sign of the cross. But just as they sprang away, Ramon Alonso saw for a moment, amidst the shining grass, his shadow between their shadows, theirs lying so far along the golden slope that they ran a little way out to the level fields, his only 5 feet long. We're going to go ahead and end the stream there today. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.